Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling neurodiversity advocacy, and we're looking at it through the lens of Dr. Jaime Hoerricks.
They're an autistic educator with a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, and they bring up this idea of a Gestalt language processor.
GLP for short.
GLP, right. Have you heard of this?
It's fascinating. Imagine, receiving complete thoughts instead of, individual words.
Whoa, like downloading a whole concept at once.
Exactly. It's not about decoding word by word.
Wow, that's got to change how you see the world, especially education, right?
For sure. And Dr. Hoerricks really digs into that in their article.
Episode 145, not reform, but revolution is needed. That's the one.
That's it. It gets into some controversial areas like ABA therapy.
Yeah, they definitely don't hold back.
But our goal here is to lay out their arguments clearly.
Exactly. No taking sides, just exploring the ideas.
So think of us as your objective guides through this deep dive.
Love it. All right, so Dr. Hoerricks' journey starts with a personal discovery.
They realized they were a GLP through the work of Dr. Barry Prisant.
And it was like a light bulb moment for them.
It totally changed their understanding of their own experiences.
Like finally seeing the world through the right lens, kind of.
Totally. They talk about struggling with language and literacy, and then, boom, it all makes sense.
That's got to be such a relief.
Absolutely. And this realization led them to become a teacher, focusing on autistic students.
They saw a need to bridge that gap between speech therapy and literacy instruction, right?
Exactly. And they even wrote a book about it, Holistic Language Instruction.
Trying to bring those ideas into the classroom. Awesome.
It's interesting how those two fields, speech and literacy, are often so separate.
Right, like they should be working together. But
yeah, and Dr. Horst ran into that frustration firsthand.
they talk about being able to identify GLPs among their students,
But not officially being able to tell the families because of their role as a teacher.
wow, that's a tough spot to be in.
It is. Knowing something could be helpful, but being limited by the system.
But they found ways around it, right? Like having those casual chats with parents.
Exactly. Dropping hints, sharing resources.
And even subtly working supports into IEPs, those individualized education programs.
That takes some serious dedication, going above and beyond for those kids.
It really does. And this brings us to a key idea from Dr. Prisant that resonated with Dr. Hoerricks.
All behavior is communication.
Now, that might seem obvious, but it gets really interesting when you apply it to GLPs.
Right. Like what might seem like random words or phrases could actually be profound expressions.
Instead of dismissing them, we need to understand the deeper meaning.
It's like learning a whole new language, and not just for GLPs.
Dr. Hoerricks argues it applies way beyond that, right? Like understanding behavior within its cultural context.
Totally. What might be considered inappropriate in one culture could be completely normal in another.
It's a call for greater cultural sensitivity and challenging our own assumptions.
Absolutely. And this idea of understanding behavior as communication, Dr. Hoerricks says it's often missing in mainstream advocacy spaces.
Especially those dominated by white, English-speaking perspectives.
Right, and this brings us to a key debate within the neurodiversity movement, reform versus revolution.
Reform is like making small changes, right? While revolution is more like a complete overhaul.
A good analogy. And Dr. Hoerricks is firmly in the revolution camp.
They argue that tweaking a broken system isn't enough. We need to dismantle the root causes.
Like racism, capitalism, colonialism, they see those as deeply intertwined with oppression.
They even use this term enshittification to describe how systems are deliberately degraded.
It's a strong word, for sure, but it captures the frustration of many, especially marginalized communities.
So enshittification, what's that look like in everyday life?
Think about the healthcare system, those long wait times, mountains of paperwork.
Or dealing with insurance companies that deny coverage you need.
Exactly. Systems that prioritize profit over people, creating barriers and causing harm.
And Dr. Hoerricks argues this enshittification hits BIPOC autistic individuals the hardest.
They're facing a triple whammy: racism, ableism, and often economic hardship.
It's like trying to navigate a world that's rigged against you.
And to understand the psychological impact of that, Dr. Hoerricks brings in the power threat meaning framework.
PTMF, what's that all about?
Imagine constantly facing roadblocks because of your neurodiversity, being misunderstood, made to feel like you don't belong.
Like everyone's speaking a language you don't understand and you're always doing it wrong.
Exactly. That constant struggle can lead to anxiety, depression, all sorts of mental health challenges.
The PTMF helps us connect those dots, showing how oppressive systems impact mental well-being.
It's not just about practical barriers, it's about the emotional and psychological toll.
And this is where Dr. Hoerricks' call for revolution gets really interesting, right?
They argue that truth progress means dismantling these oppressive systems, not just patching them up.
And challenging us to imagine a world that truly values neurodiversity.
It's a big question, but before we jump into potential solutions, let's look at Dr. Hoerricks' personal stake in all this.
They're very open about their own privilege as a white, educated individual and as a trans woman.
They acknowledge that their experiences don't represent the full reality for many BIPOC autistic people.
And they use their platform to amplify those voices, urging other white advocates to do the same.
It's about shifting power, recognizing that those most impacted need to be leading the charge.
It's about humility, solidarity, and challenging our own biases.
Absolutely. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We've laid a good foundation for understanding Dr. Hoerricks' arguments.
We've covered their journey as a GLP, their critique of the education system, enshittification, and their call for revolution.
Now let's dive deeper into what that revolutionary change might look like, the alternatives to these broken systems.
How do we build a world that truly values neurodiversity?
That's where things get exciting. Dr. Hoerricks draws inspiration from some unexpected sources.
I'm all ears, let's do it. Okay, so we're talking revolution, not just tinkering from the edges. Dr. Hoerricks is suggesting we need to completely rethink our systems and even bring capitalism into the mix.
Yeah, they make a pretty bold statement saying capitalism itself might be the problem.
Whoa, that's a big one. But I can kind of see where they're coming from. Capitalism's all about profit, right?
Right, and that often comes at the expense of people and the planet.
So how does that tie into neurodiversity? I'm not quite seeing the connection.
Well, think about it. Capitalism thrives on efficiency and conformity.
Got to keep those wheels turning.
Exactly, and that can be a real struggle for neurodivergent folks who might think and learn and communicate differently.
It's like trying to force everyone into the same mold, even if they don't fit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Dr. Hoerricks argues that this clash between neurodivergent needs and a system that demands conformity leads to all sorts of problems.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, exclusion, for one, discrimination, even exploitation.
They bring up ABA therapy as an example, right?
Yeah, ABA is a really complex issue, and there are tons of different opinions on it.
Dr. Hoerricks seems pretty skeptical, though.
They are. They're concerned that ABA can be used to suppress natural neurodivergent behaviors, kind of forcing people to conform.
So instead of trying to make autistic people fit into the existing system.
Dr. Hoerricks is calling to something much more radical, like changing the system itself.
Okay, so what's the alternative? What would that even look like?
Well, they point to some pretty heavy hitters. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Mao, Fanon.
Wow, that's a pretty diverse group of thinkers. I mean, they're all over the map historically.
They are, but what they share is a critique of capitalism and a vision for a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so what specifically resonates with Dr. Hoerricks?
They're really interested in alternative economic models, systems that prioritize collective well-being over individual profit.
Gotcha. So instead of every man for himself, it's more about we're all in this together.
Exactly. Think about worker-owned cooperatives, community-based resource sharing, systems that value caregiving and interdependence.
Interesting. So shifting from competition to cooperation, from individual gain to collective thriving.
That's the idea. And Dr. Hoerricks believes these kinds of models could create a world where neurodiversity is not just tolerated, but celebrated.
Where being different is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Absolutely. Everyone gets to contribute their unique talents and perspectives.
I like that. It's a pretty radical vision, but definitely inspiring. The question is, how do we get there from here? It seems like such a huge leap.
Well, Dr. Hoerricks reminds us that revolutions don't happen overnight.
Rome wasn't built in a day, as they say.
Exactly. It starts with small acts of resistance, shifting our mindsets, building alternative systems within the cracks of the old ones.
So what can we do? Like right now, as listeners to this deep dive, how can we participate in this revolution?
Dr. Hoerricks is very clear that white advocates, especially, have a responsibility to step up and support BIPOC-led movements.
Meaning listening to and amplifying the voices of those most affected by these systems.
Exactly, and using our resources and platforms to support their work.
So it's not about coming in with our own solutions, but rather asking, how can I help?
Right, it's about being a genuine ally, not just making a show of it.
Stepping back and letting those who've been marginalized take the lead.
And it's about being willing to take risks, to challenge the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable.
Dr. Hoerricks is definitely walking the walk here. They're open about their own experiences as a trans woman and talk about the importance of intersectionality.
Recognizing how different forms of oppression connect and reinforce each other.
So it's not just about fighting for one cause. It's about understanding how they're all interconnected.
True liberation means dismantling all forms of oppression, not just the ones that directly affect us.
It's a powerful message. And for those of us who are just starting to learn about these ideas, where we begin?
Dr. Hoerricks suggests starting by simply educating ourselves about the experiences of neurodivergent people from marginalized communities.
There are so many resources out there, books, articles, podcasts, created by neurodivergent people of color.
Taking the time to learn from those voices is crucial.
And beyond education, there are so many ways to get involved, right?
Absolutely. We can support organizations working for change, donate, volunteer, or just spread the word.
And we can challenge ableist language and assumptions in our own circles.
Those everyday conversations can make a difference. It's about creating a culture of respect, understanding, and inclusion.
And remembering that change doesn't happen overnight.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks, but every act of resistance, no matter how small, contributes to the larger movement.
It's about keeping the faith, staying engaged, and pushing for a world where neurodiversity is celebrated, not just tolerated.
That's what makes Dr. Hoerricks' work so powerful. It's not just a critique, it's a vision for a better future.
A roadmap for a society that values all its members.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we want to leave you with a question. What does revolutionary advocacy look like in your life?
What skills, resources, passions can you bring to this movement for change? Think about it, and we'll pick up this conversation in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive into the work of Dr. Jaime Hoerricks. We've been exploring some pretty revolutionary ideas about neurodiversity advocacy.
Yeah, really pushing us to think beyond just tweaking the existing systems.
Totally. Dr. Hoerricks is calling for a complete overhaul, especially for those facing multiple layers of marginalization.
It's a big challenge, dismantling systems of oppression, but they offer some practical steps we can take.
One thing that really stuck with me is their emphasis on not imposing our own solutions.
Right, it's not about white advocates coming in as saviors.
It's about recognizing that the people most impacted by these systems should be leading the way.
Absolutely. Amplifying those voices, following the lead of BIPOC-led organizations, and supporting their work.
So instead of thinking, I know how to fix this, it's more about asking, how can I help?
Exactly. It's about humility, solidarity, stepping back, and letting others take the lead.
And Dr. Hoerricks also reminds us that true allyship involves risk.
It's not just about posting on social media or making a donation.
It's about challenging the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, using our privilege to create space for others, to speak up against injustice, even when it's unpopular.
They connect this idea of risk to their own experience as a trans woman.
Navigating a world that's hostile towards gender nonconformity.
It's a powerful reminder that change requires courage, both personally and societally.
And for those of us who are just starting to learn about these ideas,
Where do we begin? It can feel overwhelming.
Dr. Hoerricks suggests a simple starting point: education. Learning about the experiences of neurodivergent folks from marginalized communities.
There are so many resources out there, books, articles, podcasts by neurodivergent people of color.
Taking the time to learn from those voices is crucial.
And beyond education, there are so many ways to get involved.
Definitely. We can support organizations working for change, donate, volunteer, even just spread awareness.
And in our everyday lives, we can challenge ableist language and assumptions.
Those small conversations can have a ripple effect. It's about creating a culture of respect and understanding.
It's a long-term commitment, right? Change doesn't happen overnight.
It's a marathon, not a sprint, and there will be setbacks along the way.
But Dr. Hoerricks reminds us that every act of resistance, no matter how small, matters.
It all contributes to the larger movement for justice.
It's about keeping the faith, staying engaged, and working towards a world where neurodiversity is celebrated, not just tolerated.
That's what makes Dr. Hoerricks' work so inspiring. It's not just about what's wrong, but about a vision for a better future.
A roadmap for a society that truly values all its members.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final question. What does revolutionary advocacy look like in your life?
What skills, resources, passions can you bring to this movement? Maybe you're a writer, an artist, a community organizer.
There are so many ways to contribute. The key is to find your own path and commit to the work of building a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been informative, thought-provoking, and maybe even a little inspiring.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a world where everyone can thrive.
Until next time, keep diving deep.